When Rachel Chiesley was 10, her wealthy father murdered a judge on Easter Sunday. He was captured on the spot, his hand was cut off, and then he was taken to the Mercat Cross in the center of Edinburgh, where he was hanged in a public execution. This would be the beginning of a life that would be fraught with treason, uprisings, kidnap, and exile. That kidnap and exile would bring Rachel Chiesley here, to the island of Hirta, amongst the island chain of St. Kilda, where she would live in a modified storage hut for almost a decade. The kicker, though, is that the man who organized the kidnapping and transportation to St. Kilda was her estranged husband, Lord Grange. So how did it come to be that Rachel, the Lady Grange, mother of his 9 children, ended up here 40 miles off the Scottish coast, living in a stone hut? After her father's execution, she was raised by her lord uncle, and was left an inheritance by 2 other uncles that left her a wealthy woman. Described as a wild beauty, though with the same temper as her murderous father, her marriage to Lord Grange was for the most part uneventful. Standard nobility stuff, producing children and splitting their time amongst their estates across Scotland. As time went on, though, her angry outbursts, directed mostly at her children, as well as strife within the marriage itself as she discovered her husband's infidelity, would bubble over into public arguments and threats of exposing her husband's role and sympathy for the Jacobite cause to disrupt the crown of the British throne. Lord Grange, whose brother, the Earl of Mar, had already been exiled for treason for his role in the Jacobite uprisings, and whose reputation was always at risk of the same, decided he had to ensure Rachel would not compromise his safety. That's how it came to be that on the night of January 22nd, 1732, a group of men forced their way into her house in Edinburgh and abducted her. Despite being over 50 years old by now, her reputation for having a ferocious temper was put on display as she fought back, resulting in a violent struggle that concluded with several of her teeth being knocked out and her being blindfolded and bound for her transport out of the city, with multiple locations established to keep her from escaping or being seen, all organized by Lord Lovat, another Jacobite sympathizer. Her disappearance was noted by the public and, more obviously, by her children, none of whom made any attempt to locate or recover her. Her treatment of them in public displays had apparently made them very reluctant to bring her back into their lives, which would result in her having few, if any, people to request assistance from, if she were even able to get a message out during her captivity. Supposedly, her husband would organize a funeral for her sometime later, effectively ending her known life in Edinburgh. At first, she was brought to the Monach Islands, living for 2 years in total isolation under the watchful eye of one of the island's lords. In 1734, 2 men arrived and instructed her to prepare to move once again, this time to the Orkney Islands. This was a ruse, though, as they sailed here instead, to Hirta, the largest island amongst those that make up St. Kilda. Hirta's history and the history of the islands of St. Kilda stretches back at least 2 millennia. Iron Age pottery has been found by archaeologists, and one instance that may be Bronze Age may even date habitation at even earlier, with some estimates as far back as 4,000 years. Upon Lady Grange's arrival, the population was less than 100, having been devastated 7 years earlier by an epidemic brought from the mainland, bringing the population from between 150 to 200 down to only a few dozen. Some families would move here from other parts of Scotland, but the population would never really go above 100 ever again. Most of the residents here lived in what was known as the village of Hirta. Life on Hirta was isolated, exactly as Lord Grange intended for his exiled wife. Few maps existed that even showed the island's location, which meant getting there required knowledge that only the local residents of the northwest Scottish Outer Hebrides Islands had. The only way to get to the island was a several-day journey on an open boat, and the seas only allowed that from late spring to early fall. Otherwise, the risk was too great. Winds could reach over 140 miles an hour, and waves of over 50 feet were recorded during some of the fiercest storms. Almost entirely cut off from the rest of the world, the islands were in many ways a prison for Lady Grange, who didn't speak the native Gaelic and was amongst few residents who spoke English. The years went by miserably for a woman who was, for all intents and purposes, still nobility. Her lodgings were an old cleat, a unique structure found only on the St. Kilda Islands. Built as stone storage huts, she lived here at the whim of the weather, often with rain and snow coming through the cracks during storms, which were frequent. Most likely, she subsisted on the generosity of the local population and the church minister in order to be fed and cared for. The community shared almost everything, from the required work, foraging, fishing, bird hunting, and tending to the animals, which was made up by a small flock of sheep and cows. There isn't a single tree on Hirta, and few vegetables were grown, most of which were potatoes. In her own words, she described it as a viled, nasty, stinking, poor island. And supposedly she spent most of her time conversing her misery to the sea during long walks along the rocky shoreline, and when able, she would drink whatever alcohol she could get a hold of, mostly whiskey. When she wasn't drunk or yelling at the ocean, she slept in her primitive stone hut. In an attempt to get discovered, she also wrote letters, sneaking them off the island with the help of the island's minister, who was probably happy to try and get her off the island. The first letter to reach anyone that could help was written in January of 1738, and it was only delivered to the addressee, her lawyer, Thomas Hope, in December of 1740, almost 3 years later. The contents of this letter describing her situation obviously caused a stir amongst the residents of Edinburgh, but the Lord Grange's powerful friends managed to prevent it from going viral. They did this by threatening her lawyer, Thomas Hope, with the ability to influence his potential exile as well, which they had a reputation for doing amongst their fellow noble peers, and apparently their spouses. They were obviously concerned that their plan was potentially falling apart, and a scheme was made to move Rachel from Hirta to another location, keeping her from exposing any of the Jacobite sympathizers around her husband. Despite this, Hope organized a ship and 24 men to go out to Hirta to recover her. Arriving in February 1741, they found themselves too late, as she had been removed the previous summer, her letters having incited a bit of concern amongst her husband. She would spend the next 5 years being transported around the various highlands and outer islands that make up northwest Scotland, supposedly at times being held in caves and in remote locations. This would all come to an end here, at Trumpen, on the island of Skye, where she died in May of 1745 at the age of 66. In August of the same year, the last of the Jacobite uprisings kicked off, lasting until their defeat at the Battle of Culloden in April 1746, less than a year after her death. Many of the sympathizers were executed, including Lord Lovat, who was instrumental in Rachel's abduction and disappearance. Jacobitism would end there at Culloden. Despite this, Lord Grange himself was mostly unaffected. He had spent a majority of his life as a wealthy aristocrat, with only a few interruptions by his wife, who he managed to keep in exile for the last years of her life. He died at the age of 75 in London in January of 1754, 8 years after the end of the Jacobite cause, and 9 years after the death of his wife. St. Kilda itself didn't survive much longer as a populated place. It modernized only slightly during World War I, with British troops bringing mail, supplies, as well as communication. All told, though, it was lightly defended, and Village Bay was shelled by a German U-boat, resulting in some structures being damaged, and one unlucky sheep being killed. This introduction of outside influence, though, led to the island's residents becoming less self-reliant. Shortly after the war, the population halved from 73 to 37, with most of the men leaving for the mainland. Illness and crop failure followed shortly after. In 1930, the decision came to evacuate the remaining residents. The sheep and cows were taken off island first and sold to mainland farms. Sadly, the working dogs were then drowned in the bay, unable to be taken on board for the trip. The residents then left an open Bible and a pile of oats in their homes, took one last look, and closed the doors behind them. They then climbed aboard the ship Hebrides and set off for the Morvern Peninsula on Scotland, most never to return to the place that had been inhabited for thousands of years. Check out another video here. Thanks for watching. Thanks to my Patreon subscribers for helping me get here. And as always, until next time, get lost.